Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road toward the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether attending your own funeral could actually be a desirable thing. In a corner by the fire are three people. One of them is trying to convince the other two that he has this great fence, and the other two could have the privilege of whitewashing it if only they're willing to pay the right price. And that's me, your host, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And as always, please, if you get just a few seconds, rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. That helps us out so much. Really appreciate it. And let me turn now to our co-host, Evangeline Denmark. Evangeline, I'm very happy to talk about Tom Sawyer, some other middle grade stuff with our guests. Before we get to that, I'd like to talk about me living an element of Tom Sawyer in my real life.
Okay. So, okay, yeah, I'm picturing your brothers convincing you to do something that you didn't really want to do. So please explain.
Well, it's sort of like that. So, you know the scene in Adventures of Tom Sawyer when Tom and Huck attend their own funeral?
Yeah.
Okay, so my grandma Pat, who should be listening to this, hey Grandma Pat, she went to a few funerals of relatives, and she was like, hey, this is so fun. All the family coming in here, spending time together. I don't want to miss out on this for my own memorial service. So let's have the memorial service for me before I die. So a couple weeks ago, we had the first annual living memorial service for my grandma.
Oh my gosh. I love your grandma already. I love your grandma.
So the whole family comes in. All 18 of my first cousins are there. It's a big old group. And during one of the evenings, we have a memorial service for Grandma where each of the 19 of us cousins gives a eulogy. And
oh, my gosh.
Because there's 19 of us, if we all go even 3 minutes a pop, this is going to last a long time. So it's like, okay, 3 minutes. I had my little anecdote. I had my G.K. Chesterton quotation because I'm a nerd. And I had all this stuff ready. But the whole time, my grandma's heckling me from her seat next to me. So I have the weird distinction of giving a eulogy and being heckled from the casket. So
that is like the best story ever, and I aim to be just like your grandmother when I'm that age. I think she's got a good idea there.
Oh, she does. And Grandma, one of the things I did is get her set up on the podcast, so she should be listening to us now.
Hi, Grandma
Good to see
Pat.
you, Grandma Pat. Love you. I forgive you for heckling me about beating me at checkers when I was a kid. But speaking of hijinks, this is an episode I'm really excited about because it gives me a chance to delve into a lot of different things that I'm really interested in. Folks who listen to the show would know that we've had S.D. Smith on a couple of episodes. He's a great friend of Anselm, writes some really great The Green Ember books. Check them out, especially if you have middle grade readers in your home. And this guy was vouched for by S.D. Smith himself, or Sam as we call him around Anselm. So started looking at what he does, like, yeah, this is very much in line and very much what we want to talk about. So Glenn McCarty, welcome to the pub table.
Hello there. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. Thank you so much for joining us. And you are, well, I'll let you tell a little bit more about yourself, but you are also a middle grade writer, just like S.D. Smith, and you have a lot of stuff going on. But why don't you give us the elevator pitch. Who are you? What do you do?
I am a writer and middle school English teacher, and I live out here in Western New York. We have a couple of boys and a dog, and we live in a small town right in the village here, and it's very walkable, and this part of the state is just kind of like an outdoor playground. There's lots of hiking and outdoor activities, creeking. We love to do creeking this time of year in the summer. And I feel like I sort of tell people I write stories to gather around. I think probably the thing that I would hope would characterize my stories is that they can be enjoyed by people who kind of share them, whether that's in a read aloud or an audiobook, or someone who reads the book and then sort of passes it on to a friend or even a parent and says, hey, you got to read this. And then there's a great conversation that has an opportunity to develop because they've shared that story together. That's something that kind of drew me to writing in the first place. And I would hope that I can kind of pay that forward a little bit,
Ooh, I have a question, though.
Yes.
What is creaking?
Oh, well, at my age, it might be a couple different things. Especially first thing in the morning. But yeah, I mean, there's these great little streams and creeks that flow through places here, and the elevation changes, and there's enough water to splash around in. But then, if you're lucky, you can get to a couple places where these great little waterfalls or swimming holes that happen, and you sort of hike up the creek as much as you can to get wet. You just get wet.
Okay. So now, is your water, like in your streams, is it cold? Because Colorado water in the mountain rivers is always cold, no matter what.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably a little bit more courageous than here. We don't. Okay. It's not coming down from the mountains around here for sure.
Okay. So it's not snow melt.
No, it's not snow melt. That is true.
Evangeline, thank you. I was wondering what creaking was too, but you're the one who had the courage to ask the question, so thank you for that.
It sounds like fun. Like, I would totally be on board with that, and I wish that we could spend more time in the rivers in Colorado. But yeah, your feet will freeze. It's not for the faint of heart.
So Glenn, I loved your description of your stories as like gather around stories, and that was one of the things I noticed on your website, glennmccarty.com. Everyone, check it out. And actually, ironically, I don't think I'm using ironically correctly, but Anselm is going into a season where we're trying to emphasize story, where we as artists, we as appreciators of the arts are trying to fit ourselves into the broader story of the world. And this is very much in keeping with that. But before we get to that in particular, let's talk a little bit about your origin story. When did you decide to be, first of all, a writer? And second, when did you decide of all the stuff to write, I'm going to write middle grade?
Yeah, I think I've always been writing things and subjecting other people to reading them. I was a writing major in college, and for better or for worse, I was a writing major in college. I had to sort of unlearn some things about writing that in college about like sort of fitting into boxes. And it took me a little while after college to sort of come to terms with the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell. It's actually kind of a pivotal moment for me was my senior year of college. My wife was an education major and I was an English writing major. And we both decided we're at the same college. Let's take a class together. And so we took a children's literature class. And at the time it was a class and it was fun. It was the thing to do. But taking that class at that age, 20, 21 years old, was like becoming reacquainted with just so many great memories and experiences and stories from my younger years. It was also, on a side note, our professor read us the first Harry Potter book, which was like a totally awesome thing because we didn't know anything about that because, it was whatever. But then like at that point in time, it was like, oh, I love this. And then I think that was like a little door that opened. And over the next few years, I would say probably within the first 5 years or so after graduating college, I was like, I had this idea for this novel. And I was like, I don't even really know how one writes a novel, like seriously, but I'm just going to try it. And I was fortunate enough to, and at the time, for some reason, it was a YA novel. I don't know why that particularly was the idea. It was a kid who was about 14 or 15 years old was the main character. And it sort of felt like one of those, if you want to call it, coming of age, transformation kind of stories. So it just made sense for it to be kind of set in that particular age range. And I was fortunate enough to fall in with this little critique group where we met every couple of weeks, I think. And every time you met, you had to bring chapters. You had to bring chapters. And over the course of time, a novel developed, and it was like, oh, okay. So people who write novels are just like people who sit down and write novels, like it's not like this magical spell thing, and that was obviously a long time ago. And I didn't really know what the heck I was doing, but there was something you asked about the whole, like writing for this particular age range. There was something very natural about fitting myself into that particular like phase of life, I guess you'd say. And I don't know what that says about like my inner psychology, but it's very natural to become 13. It's like the reverse of big or something. But like I just thought, okay, as I was thinking about what other kinds of stories might I want to tell, once I got kind of hooked on this novel writing thing is super cool, it just seemed like those were the kinds of stories that I kind of gravitated to. I found those kinds of inner struggles very engaging. And plus, I think the other thing about middle grade that I really love is there's such a great opportunity for like just kind of bonkers, off the wall, either premises or situations. And it seems like that's like the of all the different kind of age ranges that you can write novels for, it seems like it's very acceptable maybe to have like just really zany stuff happen, and the humor is a big part of that. And so I kind of found a home with middle grade that I haven't left.
I was going to say humor is such a big part of middle grade, and that age range they're just so fun and so wacky. Like I love when they discover puns for the first time. That's what I remember from my kids from their middle grade years is the puns, and you're just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But it's so like everything is new and fun and fresh for them, and it's fun to see through their eyes and through, characters in that age range.
Yeah, discovery for sure is a big theme, and that's what makes it fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. One of the many things I love about middle grade is when I look back to the books I read when I was that age, those are some of the books that shaped my reading sensibilities, my imagination more than like anything else. Like I remember vividly those books, and those mean more to me than most other books because it's at the time when you, like you said, Glenn, you're just discovering this. And those are the books that stick with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like I really believe that stories are like foundational to shaping, like you just said, kind of your imagination. Even like there's that phrase like your moral imagination, the kinds of assumptions about the world that you're kind of making as you go through that period of your life. I remember Where the Red Fern Grows. I think it was read to me the first time I ever read it by a middle school teacher. And so many assumptions about the world. And it was probably one of the first times that I became like really fully acquainted with like loss in that kind of way, and that, like you were just saying, that just provides a little bit of like an orienting experience for you. And it's strange how these like made up worlds can do that, but man, they do.
They do.
Yeah, so now let's talk about your particular made-up worlds and some of the ones that inspired them. So for folks who may not be familiar, what kind of stories do you write?
Yeah, so I've sort of found myself setting my world in 1870s Colorado, as it turns out.
Hey, now.
Yeah, there we go. I don't know if you guys have ever been to a little town called Rattlesnake Junction. You might not find it on any map in Colorado. That's the only problem. It may have changed form a little bit since 1876, but yeah, so like the American frontier. My first novel was called The Misadventured Summer of Tumbleweed Thompson, and it was set in the summer of 1876 in this little town up in the corner of the state called Rattlesnake Junction. And then about a year or so after Tumbleweed, I went back to Rattlesnake Junction for a collection of stories that are set within that world, but kind of going back in time about 20 years before the Tumbleweed book took place, and almost exploring a little bit of like the mythology of the place. So there's a story that's set right at the founding of the town, and I envisioned it as being a collection that kind of, these are the stories that, as the main character in the book, Eugene Appleton, as he would be moving to Rattlesnake Junction and learning this place, these are the stories that people would be telling around town. Oh, you hear about that one with the cows, or there's that Mosquito Hill, and just kind of, I love fictional like places, like that have many opportunities to return to them, I guess. And so that Junction Tales book was a really fun opportunity. And I certainly will probably continue. There are some other things in the works that will be continuing to return to that setting and Rattlesnake Junction in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, so as you're going, I think a lot of readers, a lot of listeners, the astute ones will notice, one, some aspects of this book that these stories you're describing, and two, my very subtle intro about Tom Sawyer. So it's pretty clear, and you admit this on your website, I didn't have to do too much detection, that The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was a major influence on this. So tell us a little bit about that and your background with Tom Sawyer.
I think my first introduction to Tom Sawyer, and this is very random, and I don't remember how young I was, but growing up, we had a lot of like audiobook tapes, and some of them were like abridged versions of the classics. And I vividly remember having an audio tape where there was a narrator. It was probably a double-sided tape. It did that cool thing where if you had the right player, it would automatically flip it over. But otherwise, you got to the end of side one and the voice came on and said, end of side one, and you had to flip it over. And it was like a retelling of Tom Sawyer, but it had like sound effects and character voices. It was more like radio theater. And I still remember like the sound of like the dripping water in the cave, just those clear details. And so that was my first introduction to the world of Tom Sawyer. I don't remember when I read it for the first time, but it definitely imprinted something about that kind of a story. And I think as I think about it, probably one of the things that I was drawn to about Tom Sawyer that probably some version of consciously and unconsciously found its way into Tumbleweed was that sort of like smaller scale, kind of boy-sized. I think my friend James Whitmer was writing about Tumbleweed for Story Warren, the Story Warren website, and he called it a boy-sized adventure. And I mean, that's kind of an interesting phrase, but I just think there are a lot of books, especially nowadays, there are a lot of books and stories that are like huge hero stories, save the world, save the galaxy, and those are fun, and I love those too. But there was something about Tom Sawyer that they had a problem that was very, very much in front of them. Maybe the problem was sort of created by their own, either curiosity or mischief making or whatever. But the problem was smaller scale. It was neighborhood sized, and I loved the Great Brain books growing up as well. I think those were set in, Utah, I want to say, but in that same time period. And just that idea of at least a general premise for a book has just been always really interesting to me. And I don't know if it's because it's a little bit more relatable, And then also I think, Mark Twain's way with language, he's a genius with humor. The way that he can create humorous scenarios. I think I'm a big fan of situational comedy where you kind of, as the creator or the author, you arrange a lot of the pieces, and then if you've done it right, the audience kind of knows where you're going, and that adds to just the build up to the punchline because they kind of have this feeling. One of the scenes in Tumbleweed that I really worked really hard on from that standpoint was there's this section of the book where there's a essay contest, and the winner of the essay contest gets a shooting lesson with this famous frontier sharpshooter, Tess Remington. And of course, Eugene and Tumbleweed both want to enter it. And this is earlier in the book. And for those who haven't read the book, they start out as a little bit of rivals. Tumbleweed is just kind of blown into town and is new. And Eugene is like captivated by how adventurous and reckless he is, but he's not. And so there's still a little bit of rivalry. And so they both decide that they're going to enter the contest. And I don't want to spoil too much for people who haven't read the book, but there's a lot of impersonating going on and not really mistaken identities and that kind of thing. And that kind of comic scenario where you kind of wind up the pieces and arrange everything in the right spot and just kind of let things go. Plus, like I mentioned, Twain's gift for language, the way the characters talk to each other, there's such a, they feel so authentic and real. He was way ahead of his time with drawing, with writing dialogue and writing the way that characters, they feel like they're conversing like real people, real kids. That was definitely like a hashtag author goal was to try to, create that sort of banter. I think if I want to say banter, I just am a big fan of, I probably overdo it, honestly. There are probably people who are like, okay, you've got a lot of banter going on. The characters can't stop just going back and forth. But I don't know, like there's something appealing about that. You got these two kids who are friends and they're out in the woods at night and they're creeping around and, they're both nervous. They're both on edge. And of course, they're just going to kind of like go back and forth with this funny dialogue. So I don't know. I think that's a lot, I think, of what And maybe that was a really long answer to your question, but that's a lot of what I think was left with me from Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn as well, which is a totally different kind of book with different goals, but retains a lot of that same kind of stuff.
I really appreciate the points that you made. And I will say I went down a mini Wikipedia hole starting this because I thought it was so interesting. But Tom Sawyer, so The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, published 1875, takes place in 1845. Little bit of trivia here. Y'all can feel free to whip this out at your next cocktail party. It was believed to be the first major novel written on a typewriter. So there you go.
That's cool.
And one of the things that I appreciate about Tom Sawyer is, first of all, I love the way you put it, the boy-sized adventures. And you can definitely see how that's getting into your Tumbleweed stories, too, because like the essay contest, the fate of the universe isn't at stake here. He's not saving the world from aliens. It's an essay contest, and they get a prize that's, a nice prize, but not a world-altering prize. So even though the stakes are boy-sized, it's still enough room to have that right adventure, to have that right amount of character development. I really appreciate that. Really, along those lines, you mentioned the gift that Mark Twain had with language, and totally agree. One of the most frustrating / later rewarding things is reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and seeing the local color, how he tried so hard to replicate the pronunciation, the manner of speech of all these different people in different areas of the Midwest and the South. And you can tell it must have been a huge undertaking, but it pays off. So your characters, they're living in the 1870s on the American frontier. How did you go about trying to get the dialogue so it sounds authentic when you have all that difference of time and place?
Yeah, and that's a good point about the sort of 30-year difference between Twain's writing and where he has it set, and obviously I've got a little more than 30 years between. I think, honestly, that may have given me a little bit of opportunity to go more into the world of imagination and fantasy. Not fantasy like fantasy, the genre, but just I think I definitely approached the way that the characters talk with a little bit more freedom to be more inventive, I guess, with expressions. And I certainly tried not to do a ton. You mentioned the sort of dialect. I tried not to sort of reproduce dialects. I think there was sort of a freedom to be almost going in a new direction with, okay, I don't really know if this is how they talked in the 1870s. I'm not sure how I would find that out. Probably something that's sort of ungoogleable. I mean, sure, you could read books that were set there, but honestly, I think for readers today, especially young readers, it was sort of finding a sweet spot between something that felt alien, that's not really the right word, but different, distinctly different from the way that characters would talk today, but wasn't so far back into the past that it just wasn't engaging, And certainly, one of the things I ran into is I definitely felt the freedom to elevate the vocabulary a little bit. It's a first-person narration. Eugene is presumably a little bit older and some time has passed since these events took place. He doesn't really say how long, but even the way that the characters talk, there's definitely some vocabulary that's fairly advanced and maybe even might be too advanced for some younger readers who come to this book and are reading it independently. But I thought that sort of added to a little bit to the color of it is, oh, wow, okay, they're just sort of rolling off these wacky words, and not just elevated words, but also words that like clearly aren't really used a whole lot anymore, And I can't really think specifically of a word. I know a word like gumption was very central. It was actually really central to like the character Eugene, and almost like his character arc in the book was he goes from a young man of 12 who reads these adventure stories. He just devours these books about this marshal named Deadeye Dan. And he just is like living in the world of Deadeye Dan to the point where he almost imagines himself like as he's going through these escapades, like being Deadeye Dan. But gumption is not a thing that he has really gotten. And so Tumbleweed does the sort of brings him out of his shell a little bit. But even a word like gumption, like when the first time that's used in the book, it feels sort of antiquated, but yet it's such a cool word, So I think it needs to make a comeback. The word gumption's time has come,
I agree. I'm a big word fan. I love unusual words. I love finding exactly the right word, and I think that's really the key to making your dialogue believable and also, just unique enough that it does feel like a different time. It's really just about word choice. As you were talking about the character being older and looking back, and it just made me think of that sort of way of framing stories. And like what jumped to my mind was the movie The Sandlot, and how it's kind of like the character looking back and having this memory and is showing how that shaped him and what he became. And I think it's interesting that middle grade audience can totally relate to that and get into that, and so can adults. And that's kind of like a magical sweet spot, I think, when you're telling stories.
Yeah. In fact, there's a passage right at the end of the book. It's like the second to last page as the narrator's sort of wrapping up this particular story or this summer. And it was a really kind of fine line to walk because, for most of the book, I wanted it to feel like there wasn't a lot of recollection going on. I wanted it to feel like you were right there in the middle of it. But then at the end of the book, the narrator kind of steps back and is saying, I tried to find a way for him to do exactly what you were just saying, which is have that little bit of perspective. And definitely, when I wrote that and was sharing it with some different, critique readers and stuff, that was just something that the adults, like you were just saying, would sort of kind of stop and just go, oh, I love that, because those of us who are older and are looking back at 12 and 13, well, there's a lot of things associated with being 12 and 13, but among them is that sort of little bit, I don't know if you want to call it like a little bit of a nostalgic ache or just something, where you remember the way that Eugene describes it is that the world just seems to kind of like get bigger. Everything seems to get brighter and clearer, and you feel like you just can go so much farther at that age whenever that happens. And I think that's a fairly universal sentiment, regardless of maybe how angst-filled your early teen years were. As you get farther away from them, certainly it's true for me that as you get farther away from them, there's something. It's not like you want to go back and do it all over again, but you feel that. And so, yeah, like recapturing that in adding that other element, like you were saying, is fun. It's a nice thing to be able to do in a middle grade book. Yeah.
It's like that coming of age story just never gets old. We're never tired of reliving that and seeing it through another character's eyes. And, because it's a really important step. And, even as adults, I love a good coming of age story. It's just pivotal. Yeah. So.
Yeah, because there's so many other elements involved in coming of age that don't stop, like when you get to be 15 or 16, I'm not going to say that I'm still coming of age. Maybe my wife would disagree. But like the humility and the necessity to grow and what are the kinds of things that happen as you grow. Like there's often like mentors involved and people who are kind of like coming to you and saying, okay, like, come up here, like here's an opportunity for growth. I would say like within the past 5 years or so, there's been some really pivotal people in my life who have provided that like mentor role that, when I was 13, when I was 18, and, now there's still things happening that relate to coming of age. And I don't know, like that's not a theory I've really thought through. Like you were just saying, that's what makes those kinds of stories so appealing. Is just all those elements that are in them that are so great.
Yeah, and I'll say very, very quickly a word in favor of using difficult or unusual words in middle grade, because I think just remembering when I was a reader back then, when you find a new word and you're pretty sure you know how it works, it's like finding a little golden token. It's so I remember reading a word in a story when I was like 12, and I looked at it, I was like, okay, rendezvous. Rendezvous. Okay, I think I get what it is from the context. Rendezvous. And like 10 years later, just pops up with rendezvous. Okay, but it's just so great to have there. So going back to the characters themselves, and once again, you can see sort of going back to Tom Sawyer and some of these other works that we're going to be talking about. I think the character of Tom Sawyer is so fascinating because he is become basically an archetype. He's sort of lovable scamp who gets into trouble. He's always into something, but he's not really a bad guy. He's just, can't follow the rules. I'm going to throw a name out there. And when I was reviewing the plot of Tom Sawyer, the first name that popped into my mind, Bart Simpson. He seems to be like the descendant of Tom Sawyer. Him and Tom are on the same wavelength, to me at least. So what do you think of the appeal of this sort of lovable scamp in middle grade literature?
Well, yeah, Bart Simpson. Yeah, there's like that, I don't know which of the Freudian things it is, but like the things that you, as a maybe more on the straight and narrow path type reader, which I certainly was, that you feel like you wish that either you had the gumption to pull off or you could try to do it, but you wouldn't do it as slick and well. And I think, in coming up with that character of Tumbleweed, he sort of like plays off of the narrator, Eugene. The first time that you see him is he and his dad are right into town and they're peddling this sort of all-in-one elixir to the people of Rattlesnake Junction. And,
I love it.
And Tumbleweed is standing on the back of the two horses that are pulling this wagon. He's got like one foot on each horse and he does like this back flip in the air and lands right in the middle of town. And for Eugene, that's like, that really is like, like Thor, or Captain America, like to him, because he's never seen that. And he pulls it off. And then their next escapade, Tumbleweed's got he just tells him this story about, there's gunpowder and there's smugglers. And there's just something about that, the combination of not just having these kinds of instincts and ambitions, but being pretty, I know for me, the kids who I knew who could pull that stuff off and not get all sweaty about it, it's whoa, man, that is so cool. And I think that definitely appeals to, a lot of people, right? I think, and that's why it's become such a kind of, I don't want to say stock type thing, but it's there,
Yeah, and I'm thinking back when I was a middle grade reader, I was a very well behaved, obedient child. So I never would have dreamed doing any of this stuff, but reading about someone do it, it's like, oh man, that's so friggin' cool. So let's sort of take Tom Sawyer and place him in the middle grade genre. So obviously Mark Twain's writing before we have all these neat little categories together. But do you consider Tom Sawyer to be a work of middle grade?
Oh, man. I know for my two boys at home who are now just 13 and 11, they both just had birthdays, so essentially 12 and 10-ish. I think my 12-year-old has read Tom Sawyer, and probably about maybe a year ago. And boy, thematically and all the stuff we've just been talking about, yes, I think so. It definitely fits in that. It doesn't have, he's, like you said, he's writing before a lot of these, maybe even unfortunately, a lot of these designations have been applied, where even the term coming of age or Bildungsroman or whatever, that didn't exist, right? So he's just doing it. So, is it a coming of age story? Maybe not. To its credit, it's probably not as much as if it had been written now, because he's not really concerned with that sort of arc, But sure, if you want to talk about a lot of the characteristics that we've been talking about with adventure and humor and discovery and meeting new characters that just kind of open up your world to new possibilities, for good or bad, even just some of the bad guys that they run into in the story, then I think all of that, I would consider it to be middle grade. It is, there's definitely a lot of prior knowledge that's needed to be built. I even found that a little bit with Tumbleweed, it takes place 150 years ago on the frontier. And you certainly have to have a little bit of awareness of just sort of the technology of the period and the way that things worked and what's a livery and what's a horse-drawn wagon. And, you kind of have to have some of that to be able to kind of get into that world. And that can be a little bit of an obstacle. But one of the things I love about middle grade is it still has such great possibilities for read-alouds, to be that kind of shared experience. And there have definitely been stories that we've done as read-alouds with our boys that maybe picking them up independently just cold would have been a little bit more of a struggle. But when you get the opportunity to, to not just explain and answer questions, but just kind of walk through it together, and sometimes reading it aloud can just bring that story to life in a way that I know that my boys both experienced Tom Sawyer first as like an audiobook on Audible, I'm pretty sure, which is, as I was saying, that's kind of how I did too. And I think that's a credit to, to Twain's voice, is that it just feels like somebody just kind of sitting next to you, maybe on a barrel, or maybe in the Anselm Society pub, perhaps.
There you go.
Telling you the story, right? Like, I got to tell you this story. So, I mean, I think that's probably more yes than no, for sure.
Just on the read aloud thing, you made me remember having to read aloud Twain's The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County to one of my kids for a school thing. And I don't know if you've ever read it. It is the most hilarious thing ever. And I could not keep a straight face. It was just an absolute mess. I think I was just like bawling with, laughing so hard. But I love that. And, and I'm sure that my son remembers that. It's, those kinds of things are just, what sticks in your mind and makes those really good memories. So, yeah, I'm so in favor of the reading aloud.
Yeah. And what a great experience, right? Like, laughing together is awesome, right? Like, laughing together is awesome. And especially, like, there are definitely read alouds where I've kind of known what was coming, and I because it was a story I had read. But within the past year, we discovered this great little middle grade series that was so funny, and we got it as a recommendation from a good friend, and so we knew it was going to be good. And I was just not, like you were just saying, I was not prepared for how funny it was. And so I couldn't finish sentences because I'd just be laughing so hard. And like, that's so, as a family, like, that's such a great experience, that we're they're kind of laughing at me because I'm not, like you said, not able to keep it together. And and then that just builds on itself. Like, I do this goofy voice and they're like, oh, that was hilarious. Do that voice again. And I'm like, oh, I got to do the voice again. Okay. And then, it's such a great shared experience.
There's something about dads doing voices, like when they're reading, that's just like, it's just like magic for those kids. And they're like, do it again, read it again, read it again.
Well, I don't mean to brag, but I have a pretty nice repertoire of voices for the stories I read my boys.
I bet you do, Matt.
I won't share them with you now, but just know they're very impressive.
We'll put you on the spot sometime.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're running a little thin for time, but really quick, I want to discuss this maybe in brief, because I was not aware of this series until you brought it up on your website as an inspiration for your stories. But tell us all about Homer Price. What does he have to do with all this?
Oh, man. I don't know. You said I can't talk very long about Homer Price.
Hey, let it go. Let it go, and we'll see what we can do with it.
Okay. So, Robert McCloskey, which a lot of people are familiar with because of books like Make Way for Ducklings and Blueberries for Sal. Phenomenal illustrator. I mean, just his illustrations are, I don't think there's anybody who you could say definitively his illustrations for children's books are any better. He's got such life with his characters. But he also wrote these two just really humorous, shorter middle grade novels, one called Homer Price and one called Centerberg Tales. I believe they're set in Ohio, I want to say, and they take place a little bit later in time than the frontier. They're definitely more 20th century, early to mid, maybe 40s, 30s and 40s, and definitely episodic. There's not like a continuous plot arc necessarily. There's about 8 or 10 little chapters, and each one is some kind of scenario involving Homer, and they're so absurd. And I think for me, definitely, without even realizing it, when I started to dream up Tumbleweed, and actually Tumbleweed started as a series of about 4 short stories that I wrote for the Story Warren website several years ago, and those were very episodic. They felt sort of like the Homer Price tales, like, oh, now we're going to have this story. And a lot of that ended up getting shaped into the arc of the book. But there are so many great things about small town kind of community life. And there's all these crazy characters. There's a sheriff who malapropism, where they like mix up the they mix up the first letters of words, and they'll say I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but he has this way of talking. It's ridiculous, and the scenarios are so outlandish. He accidentally stops a series or catches a series of bank robbers or a group of bank robbers because his skunk, his pet skunk Aroma, he's crouched outside their window, like spying on them in their little hideout, and the skunk like crawls into the room and then just like blasts them all. and so they're like totally incapacitated, and then the sheriff comes, and just sort of madcap kind of adventures. And then these great McCloskey drawings. Yes, it's so great.
I never heard of that.
Yeah, I hadn't either. So I Wikipedia'd it after I read it on your website, Glenn. And just so you know, you were correct. First one was published 1943, takes place in Centerberg, Ohio.
Yeah. Okay.
One quick word, and a pet skunk, because as it happens, when my grandma Pat was a girl, she had a pet skunk. So full circle.
I love it.
One of the things about Homer Price that really stood out to me, it is madcap, but again, within the boy-sized adventure, because you have like the crazy stuff that's happening, which really leads to the humor of it. I think it's just really in keeping with the imagination of a middle grade reader, but it's still within the confined space. So in that way, like there definitely seems to be these connections. Do you think they're all like, how do you see them as relating to the other works we've been discussing?
Yeah, definitely. McCloskey, Homer Price, and Centerberg Tales are more. They're more the kind of humor you might find in like a Saturday Evening Post or something. Mm-hmm. So I think probably less at stake, I don't know, than maybe the Mark Twain thing. And honestly, maybe a little bit more related to the stuff that I'm writing. I mean, I will always have to sort of dial back the bonkers zaniness just to keep it flowing, because one more joke, one more crazy thing. Oh, what if that happened next? And so in fact, so Tumbleweed has in the book a pet raccoon named Bingo, and it really wasn't honestly until that story itself had been totally written and published on Story Warren that I kind of like remembered, oh my gosh, Aroma. Like I had totally forgotten that Aroma was even in Centerberg Tales or in Homer Price. And then it was like, oh, that's weird how that happens. Like you have this skunk in your subconscious, and then the skunk in your subconscious. The skunk in your subconscious.
That's a problem.
That is a problem. I'm telling you, that might not just be a Colorado problem either. That might be an anywhere problem.
That's got to be dealt with. It's got to come out.
It did. It came out as a raccoon. I don't even understand. But yeah, so I think. But Twain also, as you mentioned with the jumping frog story, he liked the sort of escalating ridiculousness or something like that, And I'm all about that,
Yeah, so that's great. I was really happy to discover those, and I will probably be reading them in the near future. So like I said, we're running a little low on time, but I want to wrap it up with some talk on sort of middle grade in general. So a lot of listeners know I've been working on some of my own writing projects. Some of it involve middle grade stuff. So I've been perusing the market recently, and I've just noticed there is a big gap between the good middle grade fiction and the sort of, okay middle grade fiction. So where you're coming from, Glenn, I'm guessing you know a lot more about this than I would or most people would. So what would you say are the qualities that mark good middle grade fiction as opposed to so middle grade?
Yeah, I think good middle grade respects the particular life situation that a middle grade reader is in and doesn't ask too much of them beyond that. That might seem too vague, but I'm thinking about even with our own, our parenting of my own boys, being very mindful of there will be time for those discussions. There will be time for those conversations, and now is not the time, And I think when you're a reader encountering worlds and stories that make certain kinds of assumptions about the world and ask certain kinds of questions, I think I love finding stories where it's clear the author both at the same time respects the innocence of the reader, but also respects the maturity of the reader at the same time. And that's not easy.
No.
Because those seem like they're contradictions, but there's something about middle grade fiction and really kids at that age, whether it's, 10, 11, 12, even maybe 13, whatever, that there still is a certain kind of innocence about a lot of the world, and not like a naive kind of innocence. Just there are rooms that are not going into yet, and that's cool. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, man, there's such opportunity to really get into some really serious stuff. And that's probably, honestly, to go way back to the beginning of the conversation, that's kind of what I love about middle grade is, in the book Tumbleweed, he has the opportunity to sort of make right a wrong that's done in the town related to this town barber that he ends up working for. And the barber is accused of a crime. He's 12 years old and he's like, this is not right. I got to do something about this. And he's got this exposure to like how sometimes, the world's justice is misguided sometimes, and so it was a great opportunity to kind of get into that issue a little bit and not, dance around it. Mm-hmm. And there's that great quote, I think it's Chesterton, where he says, books don't tell us dragons are real. Stories don't tell us dragons are real. Kids already know dragons are real. It just tells us that they can be defeated. I'm like mangling that quote. But, the idea that if someone's getting to that part of the story where it's dealing with issues of justice and that kind of thing, a kid at that age, they kind of are already aware of that. Maybe they're already aware of that a lot because they've experienced it in their own life. But it's an opportunity to sort of not dance away from it, to ask some tough questions, but to respect the young reader enough to say, okay, this is a part of the world, let's talk about it, And man, I love when I get into a middle grade book that I just know that's going to be at stake. Gary D. Schmidt, I don't know if you guys know Gary D. Schmidt. He wrote The Wednesday Wars and Okay for Now and Orbiting Jupiter, like probably one of my all-time favorite middle grade young adult authors. Like he is just great for that, where it's all the things we've been talking about. It's humorous and it's light, but he just does not back away from the real stuff too, in a way that respects the particular life situation of the readers, and that's great.
It's really about like knowing and loving your audience.
Yeah, it is. It really is about the generosity of like, I love you and I want to talk to you in a way that hopefully will provide some more opportunities for you to just continue becoming the person that you're becoming,
I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Just the thought of, like you said, Evangeline, loving the audience and also respecting the audience, which I think is a really important thing and a hard line to walk a lot in middle grade for all the reasons you talked about, Glenn. So I guess in closing then, for folks, I'm guessing a lot of people listening to this, they may have kids who are at or near the middle grade range or may know kids, want to make recommendations. So what are some things you think parents should keep in mind when they're helping their kids with these middle grade book choices?
Some of what I was just talking about, like, sort of asking yourself, what kinds of assumptions does this book make about the world and the way it works? I think all stories are going to make assumptions about people and the way that the world is, and just kind of being a little aware of that. Middle grade is great because there are definitely authors who that's their, like I mentioned, Gary Schmidt. There are lots of them who, the Vanderbeekers is a great one. The Penderwicks, another great one, middle grade series, where if an author is in that group, in that middle grade club or whatever, and there's another one, oh great, like you can kind of use one and kind of play like 6 degrees of the Penderwicks. Okay, so there's the Penderwicks. What else is like that? And that can really be helpful because honestly, if you don't have time to read and understand, then it's going to be hard. But I think knowing enough to know like what's being celebrated, what kinds of choices are being celebrated, what kinds of choices are being shown to have the kind of consequences that maybe they do in the world. Sometimes I think some stories, they'll show characters making poor choices or tough ethical choices, but the consequences aren't there as they maybe would be in the real world, and that sends a certain kind of message. I would also say as an encouragement to parents, being one of them myself, is don't be afraid to get in there with them. We talked about read alouds. We talked about, any way that you can kind of experience the story with your kids is awesome, for a lot of reasons. It just validates a lot of their own experience. And honestly, sometimes they're just amazing stories, middle grade books. So yeah, I think also we talked about, don't ignore the read aloud piece. That can be a fun way to kind of get in there with them for middle grade too. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been so great, Glenn. Thank you so much for joining us here. But really quick before we go, where can we find you? Where can we find your work?
Yeah, so my name has two N's, Glenn, Glenn McCarty. That's probably the best way, like you mentioned, my website, which is glennmccarty.com, but like a lot of the social media stuff. I do have a newsletter that's a great way to find out about things that I got going on. I do have a new book coming out in the fall, which I'm super excited about. So anything like, Instagram, all the social media stuff is a great way to connect with me. And I love hearing from people who have read the books, and are experiencing them together.
All right, great. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate you joining us here. And listeners, as you can guess, things are winding down at the Anselm Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers. The customers are trundling home. You've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.